Welcome to another edition of the Customer Secret Podcast. My name is Tim Van Milligan. This is episode number 41. A couple weeks ago, I wrote a blog on my website, customersecrets.com, that was about the phrase that you often hear in sales. And that phrase is, people buy with emotions and justify with logic. Now that sounds very appealing. In fact, that was the phrase that got me started in researching personality because it sounded so logical. Because when I watched people buy, it didn't seem like it followed any logic, and yet they still bought. So I said, okay, well, this has got to be true. So then I started researching it, and I have now come to the conclusion that at best, this is a half-truth. It's not the full truth, it's a half-truth, and that's at best. And first, let me explain what a half-truth is and why it's so insidious. When you have a half-truth, what it does is it prevents you, it stops you from exploring the topic further. So a long time ago, and this was prior to the 1980s, was people would get stomach ulcers and bleeding stomach ulcers. And the diagnosis was it was stress that was causing this. People that had stress can get ulcers, and then the way to cure it is to alleviate the stress. And that's a half-truth because people with high stress often had bleeding off ulcers. And so there was this correlation there. And so people assumed that everything else was true. But they assumed that the ulcers were caused by stress rather than just being a symptom, as you might call it. And as it turns out, was that ulcers are caused by a bacteria in the gut. And there was a doctor in Australia that identified the bacteria, and in order to prove that it was the cause of the ulcers, he took it himself. What they tell doctors never to do is, give yourself the disease so you can cure it. Well, he gave himself the disease, got the ulcer, and then the cure was antibiotics, and that cured it. And so to this day, since then, we no longer talk about bleeding ulcers because the cure is so simple. It's just take antibiotics and you kill off the bacteria and the ulcer goes away. So why do people that had the bacteria also had stress? Well, because when your body is fighting something, a bacteria, it creates stress. And so you have this correlation between ulcers and stress. But it was the half-truth that prevented doctors from exploring what was the real cause of the problem. And that's what this phrase, people buy emotionally and justify with logic, it's a half-truth at best. Because it doesn't seem logical to you as the salesperson, it must mean that the buyer, the prospect, is being illogical or emotional, because the opposite of logic is emotion, which is another half-truth. There's so many half-truths wrapped up in this that it's causing a lot of issues with salespeople because they don't know the real solution or the real reason people buy. They just assume that it's emotional. And so that's what got me started is like, okay, if it's emotional, I need to figure out what creates an emotional situation that causes people to buy. And so I started studying this. It's like, okay, we're talking emotions. Are we talking like Romeo and Juliet and, teenage angst and all the feelings that go on in that situation that cause people to buy? And I as an engineer, I couldn't figure out the logic of that. So then I dug deeper and I said, okay, well, let's go to emotions. And this is where I found out that, I gotta get my notes here, that there's this confusion between emotions and feelings, because the scientists identified 10, and just 10 emotions. And these emotions, the common theme among them all is that you can see them on a person's face. And so you have happiness, anger, fear, sadness, contempt, disgust, surprise, embarrassment, shame, and guilt. Those are the 10 emotions. And so I started asking, okay, are those the reasons why people buy? And here's where it gets confusing, because some of those emotions are also feelings. You can feel happy, you can feel angry, you can feel embarrassed, but they're also an emotion. And so it's important to dig deeper in what's an emotion and what's a feeling. And if you look it up, the definition of a feeling always has in the definition the word or the phrase or the something to do with processing or cognitive processing of the situation that you find yourself in. So it's kind of like you're gathering information in, and then you make a conclusion based on that information. And that conclusion is a feeling. You're not exactly sure it's 100% true, but it leans in that direction, and the thing is, there's an infinite number of feelings, but only 10 emotions. So you can feel loved, you can feel adored, you can feel lonely, you can feel hungry, you can feel thirsty. Are any of those emotions? No. But you can also feel angry, and you can feel happy. So there's a little bit of mixing between emotions and feelings. And so, big deal. Who cares? Why should I care that why can't I mix emotions and feelings and just say people buy based on, and here's the word they use. They use the word emotional. And I have come to the conclusion that I hate the word emotional, because it's non-descriptive. It's a commingling of feelings and emotions, and it puts them into the same box. And like I said, why should I care? Because it dilutes emotions. The 10 emotions. Because these 10 emotions can be used in selling. And I'll get to that in a second. But first, when they say people buy based on emotional or buy emotionally, they're really saying that people are buying based on feelings. And that's true. But it's not, it's a half truth that they're buying based on emotions. And then, okay, and now here's, okay, so this is where personality comes in, because personality, and I've said this before on this podcast, personality and values are linked. They're the two sides of the same coin. You get one, you get the other. And values come into play here, because here's the secret that nobody knows. And it was only by challenging the assumption that people buy emotionally that I figured this out. Because there's emotions that come into play that we can use in selling to prospects. Here's the secret. Emotions are also linked to values. So now values are linked to from personality, and they're linked from emotions. So that makes values twice as important as you may even think. So emotions are triggered. Here's the formula. Emotions are triggered by an interaction with a value. And it doesn't matter which value it is. It's the type of interaction determines the emotion that's triggered. So what we can do with this, let me explain kind of like what an emotion is. Let me back up here just a second. So imagine you have a cat, and this happened to me. It was early in the morning, and I was going to feed the cat, and I took the bag of food, and I was walking towards the bowl, and the cat always, without fail, always gets to the bowl first. It just like zoom. Well, it got to the bowl, and I was still walking towards the bowl, and I stepped on the cat's tail. And this is what an emotion is like. First, it does two things. First, the cat screeches, and then it shot across the room like a bullet. So that was two things. It had the emotion, the loud screech, and then it took an action. And I got to thinking, and I said, this is just like an emotion, because emotion does two things. And when salespeople talk about emotions, they never mention this because they don't know this. I'm revealing it here for you. The two things about emotions are, first, you can see it on their face. And this is what the scientists have discovered. You know, when any one of these emotions, you can see happiness on this person's face. You can see anger. You can see fear. But the second thing is it also triggers an action. You know, like the cat, it bolted across the room. This happens 100% of the time. You step on a cat's tail, it's gone. So this is the power of real emotions. And this is why you want to use them in sales, because they trigger an action. And as salespeople, we want our customers to take an action, right? That's the whole purpose of sales, is to get the customers to take an action. So now we have this tool for them to take an action, to get them to take an action. This is our tool. So what we want to do is to trigger an emotion and get the reaction. Now, which reaction are you going to get? Well, it depends on which emotion you trigger. And how do you trigger the emotion? Well, it's always with an interaction with a value. And so let's say anger. Let's use that as an example. This is one of is a great emotion to use in selling, because it gets the person to take an action going forward. Think of it like a carrot and a stick. You know, this is the old analogy of, you know, how to get a donkey to move. You can either use the carrot approach or the stick approach. You know, the carrot is you stand in front of the donkey and you lead the donkey. The stick is the opposite. Here you're driving the donkey, you're driving it forward. Doesn't matter which one you use, you're getting the donkey to move. But some emotions drive the customer towards you, some emotions, you trigger them and it drives the customer away from you. So you have to know which way you want to drive your customer. Anger is one of those that drives them forward towards you. So this is kind of like, I want you to make the sale. I want you to, sign here. This is going to be good for you. In that situation, the two of them that you are almost always used are anger or happiness. They are those emotions that draw people forward. Now, some of them sometimes you want to drive the customer away, like you want to drive them away from your prospect or away from your competition. So then you would use a different emotion, maybe like embarrassment. Aren't you embarrassed to be using that vendor's solution? So basically you're driving them away from your competition. So that's where you might use embarrassment. So this phrase, people buy emotionally. So what does it mean to be emotionally? It's kind of like calling a cat screechy, because every time you step on the cat's tail, it screeches. So he's being screechily. The cat is being screechily. Does that make sense? No. So calling somebody emotionally doesn't make any sense, because emotions are always triggered from the outside by an interaction with values. Just because I can make you angry doesn't make you emotional. It's triggered from the outside, just like stepping on the cat's tail. So that's why I hate the word emotional or emotionally. It's a stupid word, because it's the same thing as calling a cat screechy. The cat's not screechy unless you step on its tail. So there's my rant on the word emotional. But so people don't buy based on emotional reasons. They buy based on feelings. Okay, so this was a kind of it gets a little bit confusing. You do have to separate your feelings from the emotions, and there is that crossover. Some feelings can also be emotions: anger, happiness, fear, embarrassment. Those can be feelings as well as emotions, because you can cognitively recognize the situation that, yeah, I'm angry. And so that's a feeling, but anger is triggered. It's an automatic response to a stimulus. Anytime that a value is attacked will trigger anger. So that's the formula for anger. So that's my rant on people buy emotionally and justify with logic. And I also say people justify with logic is also a half-truth. But maybe I should save that for a different podcast. So overall, it's not a half-truth. At best, it's a half-truth, but I believe it is a total lie. And once, see, lies are less costly than a half-truth, because once there's a half-truth, it prevents you from seeking the full truth. A lie, if you can recognize a lie, now you know there's a truth out there, and then you'll go search for the truth. So that's why half-truths are so insidious. They are far worse than a lie. So, because once you discover a lie, you can go after the truth. And we have to recognize those half-truths. We have to recognize the lie inside the half-truth. That is what causes growth. That's what leads us to a real solution that we can get to. So my podcasts seem to end up as rants. So that's my rant for today. But I hope it helps you to discouple feelings from emotions. The reason for that is because there's real power in emotions. And by coupling together, we lose the power of emotions, because emotions are a tool that we can use as salespeople. And I want you to use these tools. I've said this before, it's kind of like giving a little toddler a hammer. You ever watch a toddler try to pound a nail with a hammer? They don't hold the hammer correctly. They hold the hammer right at, right where it meets the head, because they don't have the hand-eye coordination to actually hit the nail. But once you know how to use the tool, you are so much more effective. Instead of holding right below the head, you hold at the base of the hammer, and this gives you power. Now you can really pound in that nail. So that's what I'm trying to give you here, is how to use the tools correctly, how to hold that hammer, how to wield it correctly so you can be effective. When you hit that nail, you're hitting it hard, and you only have to hit it once. You're not going tap, 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 spending an enormous eternity trying to pound in the nail. If you just do it correctly, that's what this podcast is all about. I'm here to help you use the tools of persuasion correctly. So I hope you enjoyed this. This was episode number 41, and we'll see you in episode number 42.